Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Charles Licciardello.
This week on our final program for the year, we will take you inside the presidential retreat at Camp David.
And Judge Shira Scheindlin will explain why the cases against James Comey and Tish James have collapsed and whether they'll be resurrected. But first,
hundreds of additional National Guard troops are being deployed to the streets of Washington, D.C. following this week's shooting of two Guard troops just 2 blocks from the White House.
This is a targeted shooting. One individual who appeared to target these guardsmen, that individual has been taken into custody.
The alleged shooter was quickly identified as an Afghan national who'd come to the United States in the weeks after the chaotic US withdrawal in 2021.
In critical condition, they've identified the individual as Rob Manula Lockenwall. Date of birth is February 9th, 1996. Last known address is in Bellingham, Washington.
President Trump quickly described the shootings as an act of terror and a crime against humanity. Then, without waiting for any further evidence, much less due process, he announced a review of all Afghan nationals to have entered the United States, and he condemned his predecessor.
The Department of Homeland Security is confident that the suspect in custody is a foreigner who entered our country from Afghanistan, a hellhole on earth. He was flown in by the Biden administration in September 2021 on those infamous flights that everybody was talking about. Nobody knew who was coming in. Nobody knew anything about it. His status was extended under legislation signed by President Biden, a disastrous president, the worst in the history of our country. This attack underscores the single greatest national security threat facing our nation.
In fact, the individual concerned was thoroughly vetted, and there's another problem with trying to solely blame Joe Biden. According to ABC America, while Lockenwall applied for asylum in 2024, he was granted asylum in April this year under the Trump administration. He'd reportedly served in the Afghan army for 10 years alongside US Special Forces troops. That is what made him a potential target for Taliban retribution when the US evacuated, which is why he was allowed to go to America. Relatives have since talked about him having struggled with what he experienced in Afghanistan and with his mental health more recently. Earlier today, in a Thanksgiving call to service members, President Trump announced that one of the 2 wounded National Guard soldiers, Sarah Beckstrom, just 20 years old, had died.
I must unfortunately tell you that just seconds before I went on, right now, I heard that Sarah Beckstrom of West Virginia, she's just passed away. She's no longer with us. She's looking down at us right now.
This is a terribly tragic situation, made more and more worrying, Chaz, by the fact that President Trump is now talking about potentially deporting the Afghans, about 80,000 of them, who came to the United States in the aftermath of the return of the Taliban because of the help that they had given the United States in their 2-decade military operation there. So these are vulnerable people, possibly more of them with mental health struggles, such as it seems this individual had. President Trump is talking about this guy having gone nuts, and yet is also arguing that this is terrorism. It doesn't meet the definition of terrorism to most experts.
yeah, he's always looking for an excuse to deport more migrants. That's not new. I think we need to emphasise the point which you've made a couple of times, but really back over it, that we don't know what motivated this guy yet. We don't know if he said anything. We don't know of any. He hasn't talked, or at least not in a way that we know publicly. So, it might be terrorism. It might not be terrorism. It could be personal. We literally don't know yet. I don't understand why we can't just wait until we know what's going on. Trump just jumps to conclusions immediately.
It's eerily reminiscent of in the minutes after the crash in Washington, D.C. earlier this year between a helicopter and an aircraft. Trump immediately blamed diversity, equity and inclusion programs in air traffic control, basically because a female air traffic controller was a part of the roster that evening. Well, there's your problem right there. It was a pre-existing problem that he'd identified in his mind, and he just puts the reality into that template.
Yeah, if there's a barrow there that he can push, he pushes it as hard as he can. If there isn't, he just brushes over it. I assume we're not going through every single murder in America to have a look at the identity groups that are responsible for each of them. I assume we're not doing that. I would, yeah. So I think, first of all, let's just wait and see the motivation. If the motivation is terror and it's related to Afghanistan, then even then I wouldn't hold the entire Afghanistani population responsible for it. But at least then you could say, okay, well, let's try and think of the causes of this and address that. Yes. I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, given that this is, and whether this person has written on social media before they perpetrated this act that they wanted to take revenge on American soldiers because of what America did to Afghanistan, he has clearly not just been suffering from mental health issues, according to his family, but become disillusioned. What has happened to him in the 5 years since he came to the United States, when he was seen as somebody who was trusted to be on special operations with the CIA in Afghanistan, a brave individual who was risking not just their life in combat, but also retaliation from the Taliban, and that this person now, we don't know what is going on, but we also know that it is for the President of the United States to simply say this is terrorism, just as before he was identified as an Afghan national, the President of the United States was saying, here's why we need the National Guard on the streets, because crime is out of control. Until he could scapegoat somebody else, he was just kind of blaming crime generally as being the problem here.
Actually, the other point I'd like to make, you just touched on there, which is he's been here for 5 years. Okay, so I'm not trying to politicise it here. I'm not going, Trump is the one who gave him asylum. I'm not doing any of that. Sure. Like, we just don't know the situation. What I'm saying is politicising it by blaming Biden is insane, because it's just completely ridiculous, because he was here for 5 years. He didn't get off the boat and immediately shoot someone. He fitted into the community for 5 years to the point where he wasn't committing acts of crime, at the very least, that we know of. And then, for whatever reason, he committed this crime. Let's find out, and then let's comment. Maybe beginning next year. Until then, I've said enough on this topic, I reckon.
Fair enough. When it comes to some of the court cases that President Trump has been trying to prosecute, there have been some fairly significant developments this week.
There have. Now, the prosecution against former FBI Director James Comey for supposedly making false statements to Congress, it's been in trouble for a long time. Aside from the distinct lack of evidence for the charge, that's a problem, the US attorney prosecuting the case, Lindsay Halligan, has been making legal error after legal error, including creating concerns that she may have twice misstated the law to the grand jury. Maybe she returned an indictment to the court that was not the same indictment that the grand jury actually voted on. That would be bad. If either of those fears turned out to be justified, they could easily have seen the case against Comey dismissed just for those reasons alone. But before we even get to those questions, this case has an even more fundamental issue, and it's an issue that's being shared with the upcoming case against Attorney General for New York, Letitia James, for supposed mortgage fraud. That issue is that the federal prosecutor for the Eastern District of Virginia determined that there wasn't sufficient evidence to charge either of them with a crime. Now, that made Trump angry, so he pressured that attorney to resign, and he replaced that attorney with one of his old personal lawyers, Lindsay Halligan, an ex-beauty queen who had literally never prosecuted a case before in her life. But unlike a real prosecutor who cares about ethics, she would at least do what Trump told her to do, and that was good enough for Trump. So Trump set about pressuring Attorney General Pam Bondi to indict both James Comey and Letitia James, and we know this because when he tried to send her a private message on Truth Social, he accidentally sent it out publicly. So we all saw it. Pam, I have reviewed over 30 statements and posts saying that essentially same old story as last time, all talk, no action, nothing's been done. What about Comey, Adam Shifty Schiff, Letitia? They're all guilty as hell, but nothing's going to be done. And then he finished with, we can't delay any longer. It's killing our reputation and credibility. They impeached me twice and indicted me 5 times over nothing. Justice must be served now. That was the seed of claims made by both Comey and Letitia James that they were being vindictively prosecuted, something that also gets an indictment thrown out of court. And something else that's a no-no is what was found by Judge Cameron Curry this week, that when Lindsay Halligan did eventually indict both Comey and Letitia James, she was apparently not actually the legitimate US attorney for East Virginia, and so she wasn't allowed to indict them. It all springs from this statute here, which states that a person appointed acting US attorney may serve for 120 days, but then after that, if they're not confirmed, then the district court may appoint a replacement until the vacancy is filled with a proper confirmation, but that is the only option. Trump didn't allow the court to do that. He just himself appointed another acting US attorney in Lindsay Halligan. This week the judge said, you can't do that. So Halligan wasn't legally appointed, and therefore the indictment that she signed is not a valid indictment. Pam Bondi tried to work her way around that by also appointing Halligan to be a special attorney and backdating that special attorney appointment to be before the indictment. So she's covered. Then Bondi said the prosecution can just go on. Halligan would return to court as a special attorney and fight on just like she was before. Bondi said Halligan was an excellent US attorney and shame on those who didn't want her in office. Sadly, the judge was unimpressed by that manoeuvre and just rejected it outright. No dice. Now, this might all sound like trivial and confusing technicalities, I understand that, but it matters big time for two reasons. One, no one that the courts are going to appoint is going to pursue either of these obviously revenge-based prosecutions. So if Halligan's done for good, then so might these prosecutions be. And two, if the original Comey indictment is invalid, then it's too late to find someone else to indict them again anyway, because we've now moved past the 5-year statute of limitations. Now, the Trump administration has argued that under Section 3288, when an indictment is dismissed for any reason after the statute of limitations has expired, a new indictment may be returned for up to 6 more months. But the trial judge dismissed that argument completely, suggesting very much that Comey's indictment was dead for good. So, I think I'm going to have to consult my lawyer. And I've got a great one for you here. Former US District Court Judge Shira Scheindlin is brilliant at cutting through legal blather. Plenty of that here. And I am thankful for her making time for us this week during her Thanksgiving holiday. I began by asking her about the statute of limitations question and James Comey's case. Does the government have 6 more months to hand down a new indictment for Comey, or is time up?
If the indictment is dismissed because it was not properly obtained, then it's considered a nullity. It's as if it never happened. So if it had been dismissed on the merits, for example, because it was a vindictive or selective prosecution, that would be different. But because it was dismissed because it was never properly returned, it may be that that extension will not apply because that indictment is considered a nullity and the statute has run. So I don't think anybody knows the answer for sure, and I think this will be grounds to litigate it from the district court to the appellate court, right to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay, and so if this thing is time barred, does that mean there is literally no other way that Comey can be prosecuted?
Well, again, not quite, because if they can find something else to charge him with within the statutory period, and maybe they can because they're sure digging around in everybody's background, looking for things like mortgage fraud or false statements, who knows? If they can find something else, it's not as if he suddenly has immunity, but this particular charge is now going to be time barred if the 6-month extension you refer to doesn't apply. That's the short answer. Now, the other thing that's going to be appealed, of course, is the dismissal itself. The government will appeal that and say that the judge is wrong. In fact, 4 judges are wrong, and that Lindsay Halligan was properly appointed. So we'll see. That issue has not reached the higher courts yet. 4 different district judges around the country have all held that you can't appoint an interim U.S. attorney after another interim has served 120 days. That's the way it works. They're saying you can't have consecutive interims because then you're cutting Congress out of its obligation to confirm U.S. attorneys. So 4 different judges have held that, but none of this has gotten to the highest court. And I'm sure it's going to get there. And who knows what the Supreme Court will say on the merits of that issue. So before we even turn to the extension on the statute of limitations, they may disagree with the judge and say the indictment was perfectly proper because she was the U.S. attorney.
Of course, Judge, this wasn't the only problem facing the Comey indictment. There were those claims about vindictive prosecution. Are they still going to be heard anyway, just in case? And I know it's extremely rare to make vindictive prosecution charges stick, but do you think in this case Comey might actually have enough of a case?
So that's a couple of questions in one, but they're both good questions. The court won't proceed to hear the vindictive prosecution motion just in case, because the trial court has dismissed the indictment. So having dismissed it, it wouldn't be appropriate to hear any more motions. But if it comes back to the court, if the Supreme Court, for example, says, oh no, she was properly appointed as the U.S. attorney, then the district court would immediately turn to the vindictive prosecution motion. So I'll reach your second question. Do I think that that would be successful? Yes, in this rare case, I think it would be successful because Trump himself has made so many statements that prove that the prosecution is vindictive. There's almost nowhere to turn. In most cases of vindictive prosecution, there isn't essentially a confession that I'm going after my enemies and I want you to get this guy because he's such a terrible guy and he's a crook and he's corrupt and all the things that Trump has said. And when he ordered his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, get this done. You know, there's 3 days left. The statute's going to run. Get this done. Well, what could be more vindictive than that when he's essentially ordering somebody to be prosecuted because it's his enemy? So I think that's another good motion that the court didn't have to reach yet because it dismissed the indictment on procedural grounds.
So can I presume from the answer that you feel the same way about the Letitia James indictment? Or do you think that's a different situation and her vindictive prosecution case might not be so easy to make?
Again, a very good question on your part. There are differences, but I think the vindictive prosecution motion is very strong. The biggest difference is the statute of limitations. In her case, there's a 10-year statute of limitations, which is very unusual in federal practice, but because it involved a government-insured bank, the statute was extended years ago from 5 years to 10 years. So there's plenty of time to re-indict her. So if the judge said that the James case is tossed out too, because Lindsay Halligan wasn't properly appointed, but they can re-indict her tomorrow if they can find the right person to be the acting U.S. attorney and not violate the consecutive 120 days. And the only way to do that is to take the chief assistant who's already been confirmed by the Senate, already in the federal government, to take over the position. So they may be able to get around that problem and re-indict her immediately, which is interesting because then the court would reach the vindictive prosecution motion in James before Comey.
Judge, it seems that rather than allowing a valid appointment to take place for the US attorney position, the government are going to persist with Lindsay Halligan as a special attorney to try to refile these charges. Would that be a mistake on their part?
Yeah, that would be a mistake because they tried that, I believe, in New Jersey, and it just was not successful. They tried that, I think, with Alina Habba, and it hasn't worked. They've tried it in 2, and so far the judges aren't buying it. It's still a workaround to cut Congress out of its job, and its right, separation of powers, to confirm the president's choice. So I don't know that the special attorney will work, but good for you for being up on that possibility.
Judge Shira Scheindlin, thank you so much for visiting Planet America.
Thank you.
President Trump's latest attempts at finding peace between Russia and Ukraine have seen a flurry of talks and claims of some progress this week. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met with Ukrainian officials in Geneva to try and find what points from a largely Russian-drafted plan they might ultimately accept.
We arrived here today with one goal, and the goal was to take, is 28 points or 26 points, depending on which version as it continued to evolve, and try to narrow the ones that were open items. And we have achieved that today in a very substantial way.
28 points, 26 points. The Ukrainians came away from those talks with a discussion about a 19-point plan with very little left from that original draft. As far as Russia's Vladimir Putin is concerned, meanwhile, there are still 28 points which have been divided into 4 separate components, he says, while adding on a more hopeful tone, this can be the basis for future agreements and that Russia is absolutely ready for serious discussions. US negotiators headed by Special Envoy and businessman Steve Witkoff are now expected to be in Moscow next week to have those discussions. Rubio and Army Secretary Dan Driscoll are handling the Ukrainian side of negotiations with a bit of input from Europe along the way, but it's unclear how and when this multi-track diplomacy will come together. And the schedule for direct talks between Trump and Zelensky and Trump and Putin continues to shift by the hour. Meanwhile, concerns persist that both Trump and Witkoff are too sympathetic to Russia's position, a concern fuelled this week by reports of a phone call between Witkoff and a senior Putin aide, where Witkoff gave advice on how the Russian leader should go about pitching the US president on a peace plan aimed at bringing an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. This transcript was published by Bloomberg this week, and in it, Steve Witkoff, the American, suggests some buttering up of Trump. Putin should call Trump to congratulate him for the Gaza peace deal, say Russia had supported and that he respects the president as a man of peace. From that, it's going to be a really good call, Witkoff said, implying that Putin will get what he wants. Ultimately, we don't yet know whether this week has marked significant progress in this or not. The Kremlin is not making public concessions, neither is Ukraine. The Americans are talking up the prospects for peace, but there's a reason why this war has dragged on for almost 4 years already. The red lines, Chaz, they're pretty much where they have been all the way along the line. Ukraine wants the 20% of their territory that Russia invaded and occupied back. Russia, for its part as well, does not want Ukraine to have security guarantees that would come from NATO membership. They want to keep the land that they have. They also want to take some more. And that was one of the sticking points in that original 28 points, was that it gave Russia more than it has even managed to take on the battlefield. No wonder the Ukrainians were saying, this looks pretty much like what Putin's been asking for 3 years.
Yeah, and also gave Russia the Donbas, which is the fortified and defendable area of Ukraine. So if Russia had that, then they could just attack the rest of Ukraine anytime they like, and it would be much, much harder to defend. I should say, Russia can say as much as they like that they're ready for negotiations. I'll believe that when they say, what's written down here in this deal is enough. We will sign that and then that will be peace. They haven't done that once, not once. There have been a number of times Ukraine said, if you give us X and Y, that's it, we're signing. Yep. Russia's never done that. They negotiate, they say, oh, we want this, we want this, we want that, but they don't say, then that will be enough. They just keep on going, we want this, we want X, we want Y. And I just don't think Russia is going to be serious about negotiating peace seriously until they think they're not winning the war anymore.
Right, which is
why
why
they're winning the war.
They keep making ceasefire the 28th point.
Yeah.
As in, we need to sort out the future of this region before we will stop shooting at you.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, these sorts of processes begin with, okay, we'll stop shooting, and then we'll figure out how we stop ourselves from shooting at each other in the future. And while this negotiation is apparently underway this week, we're also seeing the Russians striking deep into the far west of Ukraine, blowing up 30, 40 people in apartment buildings this week. The Ukrainians, in return, are striking deeper into Russia, targeting their energy infrastructure. Winter is coming for both of these nations, and this has gone from a war of attrition to a war of destruction of civilian and also just domestic civil infrastructure.
But once again, Putin is prepared to do that if he's winning, which he thinks he is. So until America can convince him he's not winning, potentially through sanctions or through giving weapons to Ukraine or whatever, he's going to keep on going. Like, he's just going to keep on fighting the war. That's a rational thing to do if you don't care about the cost, which Putin clearly does not. The question for me, though, is when they finally get to a serious peace negotiation, whenever that's going to be, who's going to be on the other side for America? Is it going to be Witkoff? Because Witkoff is acting like a plant. I'm not saying he is, but he is very pro-Russian. That phone call you talked about with Witkoff, that where we saw the transcript,
yes,
that was he was telling Putin to call Trump directly before a Zelensky meeting and essentially to sabotage it. And this is how you do it, by saying this, that and the other, and Putin did. That was the Tomahawk meeting when Zelensky was about to get the pivotal missiles for the war, and Trump just changed his mind. I wonder why. We thought it was because Putin outthought him and manipulated him, but Putin didn't. His own envoy manipulated Trump and outthought Trump. And amazingly, when people asked Trump, how do you feel about that? He didn't seem to care.
Have you heard this audio that Bloomberg has of Witkoff coaching the Russians on how to appeal to you?
Well, I haven't heard it, no, but that's a standard thing, you know, because he's got to sell this to Ukraine. He's got to sell Ukraine to Russia. That's what a deal maker does. You got to say, look, they want this. You've got to convince them with this. You know, that's a very standard form of negotiation. I haven't heard it, but I heard it was standard negotiation. And I would imagine he's saying the same thing to Ukraine, because each party has to give and take.
Is it standard negotiation to tell people how to manipulate your boss?
It was a perfect phone call,
All I would say is that there is one other issue which hasn't really been discussed much, but for me, it's actually almost the most important issue this week. Where did those phone call transcripts come from?
Right.
Someone has Yushakov, the foreign spokesperson for Russia's phone, tapped, because he was part of both phone calls, the two of them. And that person, whoever, or that group, whatever that is happy to leak those transcripts to American newspapers. Is it the CIA undermining Trump because they don't like where this is going as far as helping Russia out? Is it Russia maybe throwing cat amongst the pigeons, like they're just mixing things up like they do sometimes? Is it Europe who might be sick of Trump screwing them around? Is it someone else? Whoever it is,
Ukraine.
They have. Well, I'm not sure they have the capability to be tapping the phone of the foreign minister of Russia.
But Steve Witkoff, they may well do, because Witkoff, like Trump, you know, he tends to have his own phone.
Yeah, but the second call wasn't Witkoff.
Yeah, right.
It was the Russian foreign minister talking to a Russian envoy.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
So that's it.
Yeah.
So I mean, look, maybe it's Ukraine, but I'm not sure they have that capability. Either way, it's someone with serious capability who wants to achieve serious mischief. And I think we should be talking about who they are, because they might be important down the track.
Yes. Well, ultimately, if this is just about mischief, then I guess suspect number one is probably Moscow. That's kind of their gig. The President of the United States lives in pretty much a virtual bubble. For security reasons, they're never more than a few metres away from Secret Service protection. For national security reasons, they're always contactable by staff. And, of course, they typically live in the building where they do most of their work, the White House. Until Donald Trump and his countless properties and golf resorts came along, American presidents typically had very few other places where they could unwind away from the cameras. Often it was a family home that had been upgraded for the presidency. JFK had the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport in Massachusetts, Lyndon Johnson the LBJ Ranch in Texas, Richard Nixon had the Western White House in California at San Clemente. And every president since Franklin Roosevelt has also had the official presidential retreat at Camp David. It's in the woods on a mountainside in rural Maryland, a short ride on Marine One helicopter, about 100 kilometres from Washington, D.C. And as well as relaxing away from the White House and the Capitol, it's in those rustic cabins at Camp David where presidents have also conducted some of the highest level, highest stakes diplomacy. Most famously, the 1977 Camp David peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, brokered by then President Jimmy Carter. The history and the particular purpose of Camp David is the topic of a recent book by Charles Ferguson. He knows this subject very well. He spent 3.5 years as the Camp David historian and presidential chaplain. Charles Ferguson, welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. In your book, Presidential Seclusion, you write about what you describe as the spirit of Camp David, the particular mystique that it holds. You spend a lot of time there. For those of us who are never going to get through those gates, what is the spirit and mystique of Camp David about?
I think the easiest way to say it, it's almost like going to school camp, but a really posh version of it. There's rustic cabins. It looks very rustic on the outside, but on the inside of the cabins, it's 5-star accommodations. And it's a very secluded, rural, heavily guarded spot on top of a mountain in rural Maryland. And inside those gates, all these amazing things happen. And the president gets to go there and use it however he chooses. So if he wants to bring family and friends and just relax and enjoy all the amenities, he can do that. If he wants to bring world leaders there for world-changing decisions, which has happened in the past and I'm sure will happen in the future, it's set up for that because it's essentially an extension of the White House where they can do whatever work they need to do, but also they have the ability and the time to relax and enjoy just being around. And I think it's the wonderful setting, that's just the mountains and the trees and the seclusion that gives it this aura of mystery, such that Khrushchev termed the spirit of Camp David when he visited there during the Eisenhower administration.
Charles, when we think back to things like Jimmy Carter's brokering of the Camp David peace agreement in the 1970s, was there something about that negotiation that was facilitated by the very fact that it was out at Camp David? Would it not have been possible to do the same thing at the White House?
Well, the seclusion and the ability to just kind of lock yourself away for however long you needed to. Jimmy Carter had Begin and Sadat up there for 13 days in September. So the weather was starting to cool off. It was just perfect weather for that. And he engaged in shuttle diplomacy where he would talk to one leader for the morning, one leader for the afternoon, and really just work on it. And I think that it wouldn't have been able to happen in the White House because there's always people watching you come and go and whoever's there. And by just breaking down all those barriers and having everybody live and eat together in that close proximity forces people to come to agreement. And I don't think it would have happened anywhere else. The fact that it's the longest lasting peace treaty in the Middle East really speaks to the power of Camp David and what it can do, especially with people that don't necessarily get along with each other.
And Charles, can we go back a little further into history and look at the way in which the presidential retreat that was initially known as Shangri-La before it was Camp David was first used by the likes of President Roosevelt in the Second World War, and how that sort of set the template for how future presidents have used Camp David?
It absolutely did. And I don't think Roosevelt was anticipating this being something, a retreat that would last for the last 83 years like it has. He just needed a place to get away from the pressures of DC and the White House. But because the war was going on, he wasn't able to go up to Hyde Park or down to Warm Springs as often as he wanted to, because he was rationing fuel and other things for the American public. And he didn't want to be seen as too much of a hypocrite by traveling so far. And so he set up a place just for him and his friends and a really close circle of people to come. He did invite some world leaders up there. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, she came during the construction. Winston Churchill came up in May of 1943 as part of the Trident Conference, where they were talking about how to proceed in the war. And the legend among the Camp David staff is that on the porch of Holly Cabin, what was then called Laurel, the two leaders figured out how they were going to invade Europe. Churchill wanted to attack through the soft underbelly of Europe, so through Sicily and Italy, whereas Roosevelt wanted to do a full frontal assault across the English Channel. Both of their ideas worked, with Churchill's going first. And so Roosevelt used it for so many different things. And like you said, he really did set the stage for it being such a versatile retreat for the president to work and play.
So, Charles, what's the story? How did a camp known as Shangri-La come to be called Camp David?
Oh, so that happened during the Eisenhower administration. And President Eisenhower came into office, and he was naming a lot of the perks of the presidency after his grandchildren. There were some presidential yachts and boats that he named after his grandchildren. And he realized that he hadn't named anything after his grandson, David. And so he said, well, I've got this retreat in the mountains of Maryland. Let me just name it after him. And because it looked like a summer camp or a school camp, he decided just to call it Camp David. And that name stuck, though Eisenhower had no intention of it staying. His plan was that the person that relieved him would take over and rename everything, including Camp David. And Kennedy, in fact, did rename the yachts. He just never got around to renaming Camp David before his assassination.
And looking at the way that all presidents since FDR have used Camp David or Shangri-La, what have the things that they have done there, their leisure activities, their style of diplomacy, the amount of time they spent there, told you about who they were as people and as presidents?
I think you can look and see a little bit into that. George H.W. Bush, definitely a family man, and it became a huge place for his family to visit throughout his 4 years. He has the highest rate of use. He went 124 times in just 4 years. So that matched his personality. But on the flip side, you have Ronald Reagan, a very gregarious, former actor. He pretty much shut it down so that he visited 189 times in his 8 years, but it was just him, close staff. Rarely did his family get to go up there, and only 3 foreign leaders got to visit, including Margaret Thatcher, who visited twice during Reagan's 8 years in office.
And Charles, when you were serving in your official capacity at Camp David, that coincided with Donald Trump's first term as president. What can you tell us about the way that he used it? Because obviously, unlike a lot of other presidents, Donald Trump has a lot of other options as to where he can spend his weekends.
He used it about 15 times, and he used it for a wide mix of everything, kind of what most presidents do. Friends and family would come up with him. Sometimes he would open it up for the staff to come up to use without him there. He invited members of Congress to come up in his absence. Interestingly, it was both Democrats and Republican members of Congress that came up during that first term. And I talk about that in the book and how the spirit of Camp David worked on them to get along with each other. He never had the chance to invite foreign leaders up, though there was a plan to host the G7 summit there in 2020. But because of the pandemic, it was canceled, so that event never got to occur during his time.
And finally, Charles, would you say that Camp David is a good option for President Trump now as he pursues peace in Ukraine, for example, that there might be something about that physical environment that would help him in much the same way as it helped Jimmy Carter back in the 70s?
I think the time is right for that, especially with all the things that are going on and as Trump is trying to broker some peace deals. In 2019, he had everything arranged kind of secretly. We talk about in the book where he had invited the Taliban to come, Taliban Afghanistan, to come to Camp David in 2019 to iron out a peace deal or some kind of agreement in Afghanistan, but canceled it at the last minute because of some suicide attacks that killed some U.S. troops in Afghanistan at the time. So I think he knows what it can offer, and it would not surprise me if we see a Camp David 2.0 or 2.0, 3.0, multiple versions of that over the next few years, especially as things get closer and they know that a peace deal is really close, inviting everybody up there to hammer out the details because they can do it in privacy and secrecy.
Charles Ferguson, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Planet America's Weekend Edition.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Wednesday, November 7th, 1962. It's 2 years since Richard Nixon narrowly lost the presidential race to John F. Kennedy. Now, Nixon has failed in his bid to become governor of California, and he's decided to give reporters gathered at the Beverly Hilton a piece of his mind.
You've had a lot of fun, You've had an opportunity to attack me, and I think I've given as good as I've taken.
Nixon had served as a congressman, then senator from California, before being elected Eisenhower's vice president. And in those days, Republicans often won in the Golden State, and polls showed Nixon leading Democratic Governor Pat Brown.
I shall not be a candidate for President of the United States in 1964. I shall be a candidate for Governor of the state of California in 1962.
It was a smart move. Nixon knew that Kennedy was going to be tough to beat in 1964, so he needed to stay relevant until the election of 1968. And for a while, Nixon's California campaign was looking good.
Enthusiastic Nixonites are at hand and twisting at the Pomona, California County Fairgrounds early in the morning to welcome back to the site where he started his first political campaign former Vice President Richard Nixon.
Everyone knew that this could be Nixon's last chance to regain political office and rekindle his hopes of winning the White House someday.
Mr. Nixon's race for the governorship this fall is a state campaign that has acquired far more than local interest, for upon its outcome may well depend his future in national politics.
But Nixon had plenty of enemies in California, including several prominent conservative Republicans, and now, again faced with defeat, he didn't try and hide his bitterness.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
It was a remarkable, self-pitying dummy spit. Later, on November 7th, Governor Pat Brown takes a phone call from President Kennedy. It was recorded on a scratchy White House dictograph machine, where Brown gives a frank character assessment and predicts Nixon's political career is over.
I don't see how he can ever recover. He's a peculiar fellow. I really think he's psychotic. He's an able man, but he's nuts. Yeah.
And for a while, it looked like Brown was right. Nixon left for New York to take up private legal practice and write some books. And at the age of 50, Richard Nixon looked like yesterday's man. But a year later, Kennedy was dead. Nixon stayed out of the 1964 race against the popular Lyndon Johnson, but campaigned energetically for the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, introducing the nominee at the Republican convention.
Happy days are here again.
But after Goldwater's defeat, Nixon was the obvious choice to be the next Republican nominee in 1968, where he finally prevailed.
We're going to win!
Listening to every little secret.
But Nixon's bitterness, his paranoid suspicion of his rivals and enemies in the press, only grew in the White House, setting the stage for his final disgrace. Now, we're just about out of time, but before we go, did you see this earlier today? Health Secretary Robert Kennedy tweeted out this heartwarming image for Thanksgiving. But look at this. If you zoom in on Kennedy's right hand, what on earth is that? It looks like a ham. And why is Elon Musk just sitting eating a plate of cherries? But for my mind, the most fake thing about this picture has to be the fact that Speaker Mike Johnson was ever there.
And RFK is not the only one using dodgy AI. His boss is practically making a second job out of posting AI-generated drivel.
Pritzker's a sumo, Obama arrested. Me dumping plane loads of shit on protesters. Nancy Pelosi bowed down like I'm a king. This is the weird shit that I've been tweeting. Me turning Gaza into Mar-a-Lago. Me sending choppers to take out Chicago. Jeffrey's mustachioed, Christie's eating. Me touting fake beds that cure everything. When the Pope dies, got no peace prize. When I'm feeling sad, I simply tweet out AI-created things, and then I don't feel so bad.
John DiDomenico, our voice of Donald Trump, some of your finest work, well done. That is it for Planet America's Weekend Edition for this week and indeed this year. We will be back on Monday nights on ABC TV in early February.
There's a special Thanksgiving/Christmas pep festival this weekend in 3 parts, including with one absolute megastar, Mr. John Barron there, so check that out there. And being Thanksgiving, it's a great time for us to thank the terrific team that helps put this program together each week, from the editing team to the graphics team to the studio team and even to the maternity leave team. Thanks, Melina Wicks, for cleaning briefing rooms until the last possible second. We'll see all of you in 2026. Bye-bye.